One night, I was camping near where an old river dam had been. I pulled the canoe in late, so I just dropped the tarp over the canoe and crawled in underneath it and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of roaring water. I crawled up from out from under the tarp and the sound stopped. I thought I must have been imagining it, or it was the wind through the trees or something. I crawled back under the tarp, and the sound slowly started again. This time, when I crawled out, it didn't stop. The sound slowly got louder and louder, and I realized that it sounded like water ripping through the woods. Even the dogs had their hair on end. I quickly pulled the tarp off the canoe and dragged it closer up to the top of the ridge. I waited to see what was making that noise. Then I heard the voices, men yelling and a dull thumping noise. I huddled down next to the boat, pulled the dogs close, and waited for the sun to come up to find out what was happening. Morning came, and there was nothing to see. To this day, I don't know what that was, but I have some ideas, and I'll not camp there ever again. I was told by some of the locals that the land there remembers, and that's fine. I just don't need to be there when it's remembering. Some friends and I were doing some night fishing on the James River. We were sitting along the shoreline with a nice fire going, accompanied by the usual idle talk and a few beers, when suddenly everyone just kind of stopped talking like a switch was flipped off. We were all staring across the river and felt as if something or someone was staring back. It was a very uneasy feeling, to which some of the group tried to shake off with the typical macho humor of men outdoors, when a blood-curdling sound erupted from the other shore that froze us all in our tracks. The sound was unlike any other I've ever heard, and it made my very hair on my body vibrate and tingle. The only way I can seem to describe it is it kind of sounded like a wild person, someone with no language skills, slowly being gutted alive. No words, just this high-pitched scream. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. We all just sat there, fixed in our stare, when just as suddenly a second scream was let loose, with even more force than the first. By this time, several of us had moved to our trucks that were parked within a few feet and retrieved our various firearms. We all sat there quietly with our eyes fixed, staring towards the opposite shore, watching the light from our fire reflect off the rocks. Hours later, when the sun started to peek up and dawn came, we packed it up and left, feeling very unsettled. We never did figure that one out, or even hazard to guess as what was it on the opposite bank, or what it was that was out there screaming. It was very early in the morning, around 2, maybe 3 a.m., and I was in a very open area, waiting for my boss to return with some equipment. As I was waiting, I got that feeling like I was being watched by something that didn't really want me there and had some intent on harming me. I stood up and looked around, and the moon was very bright that night, so I could clearly see all the way to the tree lines, probably 50 years on both sides of me, with the light reflecting off the snow. I didn't see anything around me, so I calmed down a bit and took my pack off my back to get a drink out. As I opened my drink, I heard this whoosh, 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 whoosh sound, flying through the air from behind me. It was kind of that sound like a stick makes if you throw it overhand at someone. I dove out of the way, with my bag falling to the ground and my drink flying through the air, spilling out as I jumped away. I recovered from my little dive and took my radio out of my bag to radio my boss. I'm not trying to freak you out or anything, but I'm on my way back to the shop. I just had something thrown at me. As I'm talking to him, I'm looking around on the snowy ground for anything that could have been hurled at me, but there was nothing on the ground I could see but snow. I had no idea what the hell was going on at this point. His reply of, I've already got a head start on you. I'll see you there, sounded out of breath like he was running. I gathered my stuff and started hauling ass back to the shop. I get back and meet up with my boss, and he's pacing back and forth in our shop and kind of freaking out. I finally get him to calm down a little bit, and he tells me he was on his way back up to me when he got the same feeling I got before something got thrown up at me. He said after that he got the feeling, he stopped to look around and heard something, clearly two legged, start walking towards him, barely just crunching into the snow. Then he said it started running at him, but there was nothing he could see in sight. All the sounds of movement suddenly stopped, and he froze, listening around for some sounds. Then he felt some sort of like hot breath was hitting the back of his neck. He proceeded to just freak out. He said he ended up running the whole way back to the shop, and about halfway back is when he heard me say something on the radio. The crazy thing about the whole thing is the place was supposed to have several burial mounds in the woods from the native tribes in the area. Apparently, they say there used to be an altar of some kind made out of stone. It seemed to have been buried during a construction project a few decades ago when they started putting the parks into the forest. As I sat in the dark in my tree stand, I kept having that feeling of being watched. Now I have hunted, camped, and grew up in the woods and am completely at home, day or night, in the darkest, deepest swamp. And I've never really had this feeling before. I just couldn't put my finger on it. When I was slithering down the tree later that morning, I saw something out of the corner of my eye about the same time that I heard it. I heard this crash, just barely caught sight of something running through the palmettos parallel to me. Now I say barely because it looked huge, kind of like a big brown dog. But honestly, at first I thought it was some buffalo from up north. It crashed through the thicket and I heard it hit water. It sounded like a herd of hogs plowing the trees. About two or so that afternoon, after started getting back up there, I'd been sitting in the stand maybe an hour or so when I heard the faint splash of hogs again across the thicket in the swamp. As it got louder, I began getting a little nervous. It was so weird because I'd never really felt that way out here before. Well, what I thought was a bunch of hogs slowly seemed to be just one single creature. It seemed to be getting closer, about 100 yards or so. I could hear it very plain and clear. But whatever it was, it wasn't in a hurry, and stayed kind of out of sight in the brush. I had scouted the area before, to find out best paths for hogs and stuff, and I could hear it plain and clear. And I knew that the water that the creature was in now was waist deep on me. But I could hear the splash, drip, drip, splash as it pulled one foot out of the water and then put another one in real slow, like it was trying to be quiet. I thought it might have been some other person till I thought about how deep that water was. Now, I've never pointed a gun at a noise that I wasn't planning to kill dead, but as the noise got louder, I noticed I was looking down my barrel and was shaking something mad. The creature eventually got to the edge of the water with about 40 yards of thicket between me and the open ground between us. I could just barely see something crashing about 10 to 15 yards out, and then all went quiet, very deathly quiet. No frogs, no crickets, no birds, no nothing. I might imagine it, but I thought I could hear something snorting every now and then, like it was slowly slipping in on me. It started getting dark by then, and to say I was shaken would be an understatement. I never really saw or heard anything else that evening, but I was so put off by the sounds that I just left my bag hanging on that nail in the stand. It was 2 days before I got the nerve and was made fun of enough to go back after my bag. But when I returned, the bag wasn't there, and the bark in the tree had been scratched and clawed up to hell, as if something large had rubbed up all the bark off of it. I've not ever been back to that swamp, and I've told a few people that I've seen about that creature. No one seems to believe me something that big has been down here this far.